Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your patience as we put together what promises to be a very exciting panel. We are so thrilled that you can join us. I'm Anne Collins Goodyear, co-director of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. We are delighted that you can be with us for this special program featuring Richard Tuttle and Martha Tuttle. Our event is inspired by the confluence of two exhibitions. At First Light, 2 Centuries of Artists in Maine, in which 3 drawings by Richard Tuttle appear, and Helen Frankenthaler and Joe Sandman, Without Limits. The latter exhibition juxtaposes the printmaking of Frankenthaler with the more process-oriented work of Joe Sandman, and reflects the commitment on the part of both artists to engage in experimental processes to move beyond the conventions of abstract expressionism. This formal movement, rooted in painting, dominated the art world in which Frankenthaler and Sandman matured and governed the training that they received. Of critical importance to this breakaway from painting's hegemony, I would argue, was the reinvigoration of printmaking during the 1960s. Frankenthaler herself would prove a pioneer in what has come to be known as the print renaissance of the 1960s, involving not only Frankenthaler, but other experimental artists such as Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, Andy Warhol, June Wayne, and Lynn Drexler. It is intriguing to me that although Sandman's work does not delve deeply into printmaking, it does participate in fascinating ways in aspects of its processes and its techniques. Her folded drawings, for example, demand the pressure of an industrial press, bringing to mind the force through which plates and stones yield pictorial prints. Her removals require the meticulous scraping away of a waxy surface from insulation foil to create marks, a process reminiscent of etching. Printmaking has long been linked to an ethos of experimentation, and it has often served as an important element of the groundbreaking work of many transformative artists. Among these individuals are Richard Tuttle and Martha Tuttle, who will discuss their relationship to the print today. We are delighted to welcome Richard, who joins us here in person, as well as Martha, who joins us from Brooklyn through the magic of Zoom. This hybrid format seems remarkably appropriate to the larger commitment to experimentation signaled by this program. Both Richard and Martha not only create visual art, but also write in compelling fashion about the observations and questions that intrigue them. Last February, as Alicia Asamabor of the class of 22 and I worked on Helen Frankenthaler and Joe Sandman Without Limits, we were intrigued by an essay published by Martha Tuttle in the Brooklyn Rail entitled Printing in the Desert and Listening to Radio Preachers. The piece meditated on the relationship between pressure and softness implicit in printmaking, the creative process, and in life itself more broadly. By a similar token, I have long admired Richard Tuttle's poem, A Print is Not a Drawing, a piece that appeared in the catalog that accompanied the Bowdoin College Museum of Art's 2014 retrospective of the artist's prints, and the catalog is still available. It's a gorgeous publication. Printmaking, Tuttle demonstrated, operates in a space of becoming, or of transformation. For both Richard Tuttle and Martha Tuttle, who happens to be his daughter, art making is an arena of interrogation. They're deeply reflective practices in which printmaking occupies an important position, create an exciting opportunity to open up new questions and connections, as today's discussion promises to do. As is well known to this audience, Richard Tuttle is one of the most impactful artists of his generation, embracing non-traditional materials and practices in his work. Tuttle, with his attentiveness to scale and modes of installation, stimulates his audience to attend to detail and in turn to interrogate their own environment. Richard Tuttle's work has been exhibited and collected by leading institutions around the world, including the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. He has been the recipient of many awards, including the Skowhegan Medal for Sculpture in 1998 and the Aachen Art Prize in 1998 from the Ludwig Forum for Internationale Kunst. In 2012, he was elected to the National Academy, and in 2013, he was invited to become a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Tuttle was the artist in residence at the Getty Research Institute from September 2012 until June 2013. In addition to creating visual art, as I have noted, Richard Tuttle is a talented writer and is the author of numerous essays and books. In his 2017, The Role of the Storyteller, delves deeply into the role of color in art and in life. Tuttle's written works were recently anthologized by Dieter Schwartz and Richard Tuttle, A Fair Sampling, Collected Writings, 1966 to 2019. Martha Tuttle is an artist and writer who works at the intersection between painting and sculpture. She is interested in the intimacies and discourses possible between entities of varying scales and time frames, such as the human and the mineral, or the pebble and the interplanetary. Martha's work has been collected by leading institutions around the country, including the Museum of Modern Art and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and has been exhibited internationally. Martha's art making has been supported through numerous awards, including from the Montello Foundation, Tuss and Talk, and the Joseph Albers Foundation. She has participated in such residencies and programs as the Asian Art Archives Leadership Camp, the Rauschenberg Foundation Residency, Sandra Green Farm Residency in Norsund, Norway, A to Z West in Joshua Tree, California, and the U-Cross Foundation Artist Residency. Her writing has appeared in publications by the Radius Press, the Brooklyn Rail, and Baum, among others. Martha Tuttle's current work contemplates the intertwinement between faith and landscape. This afternoon, Richard will speak first for approximately 10 to 15 minutes, followed by Martha. Following their formal remarks, the artists will engage in a conversation with one another, and after that portion of the discussion, we will open things up to the audience. Thank you again for being with us, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Richard Tuttle and Martha Tuttle.
I'm just suggesting I'll read this piece that I wrote for today, and then the PowerPoint will go through images of my last exhibition, and there'll be a little bit of time left to say what you've been looking at, I guess. Two personae. Persona 1. I never thought I would get old. Everything gets old. Shoes get old. Dogs get old. Jokes get old. I never thought I would get old. Why? Because I don't like old? I like old trees, old oak trees, 1,000-year-old Douglas firs. But these likes are present. You don't have to think about the past. Do you think about the future in the first half of your life and the past in the second half because there's more of it? I don't know. I never wanted you to see me get old and think about the past from it. You get the same idea when you think you are always in the prime of life. No upkeep, no plumbing, no electrical problems. Day one. Not that I wanted to live forever either. What did I think I would find never growing old? Some comfort with stuff I'm used to? Maybe I thought growing older wouldn't stop me because I took no notice of it. As if growing older was a thing that could lead you around a corner and was out of view for a moment when you were on the other side. I don't want to stop. How does anyone know how to ask a question about never dying? Not getting older is not doing nothing. It's very hard to look blank when you're looking for the mother behind the tree, or fetched the way we had to nominate the dog to the dog cellar. Not getting old comes off rife and snobby. You really have to try to let the lantern get cold before you lose the self. I know a way. I could befriend people and never think of age. Time would move on by, and I would only be thinking of people. In fact, that is what I've been doing. What difference does it make how old I am? I wouldn't be aware of it if I didn't experience how much longer it takes to do everything, or how I do not remember the recent past so easily. How can you be a person who never thought they would get old? One thing we all do is think of the cutting edge where stuff happens. You can sniff out the cutting edge and be on it. Stuff usually happens on the cutting edge, and artwork can be there. It can capture time in a place. Wow. What else can do that? Think of a person who is not a victim of time or place, but can make time and place what they need to never get old. Maybe I was dreaming of that when I missed the cue for letting me know how we get older. Or what about the tastes and feelings for mellower things? Or the moment when Venus sets, usually reserved for the old. And artwork has time that never grows old. Maybe I can turn into an artwork enough to never grow old. But now that I am old, I am happy to have never grown old. How my thoughts are what's right. I thank art for that. The truth of art exceeds the truth of nature. Maybe I can control nature, but I cannot control art. How can I look for truth in something I cannot control. If I couldn't, God would be nature, and I couldn't tell the difference. Persona 2. I always thought my senior period would be my best. Because there is so much for you to learn and no one to teach you, if you adopt the American tried and true method of learning by doing, you are inevitably going to take a lifetime to do your best work. Step by step, you accumulate the purpose and dedication, honing your skills, learning about yourself, freeing yourself from the fetters of belief patterns, prejudices, preferences for simple solutions over more difficult ones, and many other hazards like these. Communication is partial or not at all. The late work of Titian communicates despite or because of difficulties. Late work of artists can be their best, so why not think ours will be too? This is missing the point, because we are talking about life, the journey of life. To say one's work will be best at the end is saying the journey will end well. This also means it will be less well before. So be it. It can't all be the best. Communication is with people. It is amazing how much we are about other people. Even the work we do is about other people. Why we want to do a good job is about others. All others. It makes me happy to think my best work is the late work, because it will be closer to people. As we grow closer to people, our art gets better. The intention is the same as in the development of truth or fiction. This is known. A little boy from New Jersey heard the clang of the momentous discovery across the river, but of course did not know what it meant. That art was the highest ethical choice was certainly part of it. Meaning at the end of World War II was its call for creativity to build a world that had not been blocked. The use of those thousands of dead so their lives were not sacrificed in vain. The drift of the center of art from the moribund, if not fatally destroyed, Europe to New York occurred. A change so great it appeared to set alight a long fuse that would never end. We were not glad to end the war. We were glad to create a world that fulfilled the promise of victory and whatever that meant. It was inclusive, lovely, dangerous, and new. The codes were new codes that promised to tell the difference between mythology and truth. Of course, you could learn these new codes. There was, and always is, the threat of power wanting to take over right. We have seen how the slow building of an invisible, power-intoxicated bass can respond to one word from an individual who knows how to access it and make it visible. The game of the visible and the invisible must be taken on by the artist, who can show that right is stronger than all the power there is in the world. Even if there is no audience for it, or if there is a criticism against art itself for being wrong. This criticism, which we have seen before, is one of the chief signs of a sickness in society, and sickens the artist most of all. How to stand naked as an artist, facing the impending gale, alone and hopeless, is still the gale's last hope of meaning in the night that surrounds the hearts and minds of so many of us, the last species of night's porosity. Thank you. Thank you. These are one of the things going on here is a question of roots, really. And so the images like these images are small, model-sized works that were really built on the removal and feeling okay about waste. They grew up, those little models grew up into something which didn't require, this is indoors, they didn't require those bases anymore, but they were connected to the corner where the floor meets the wall. And there were 10 of them, and from that 10, 4 were selected to be made into bronze. And what you see on the left is an example of one of the bronzes. And then, of course, the 2 on the right are the wood examples. As the one in the back there, it's example. My work seems to continually have this theme of the shadow and how the shadow is part of becomes part of the work. Also the reflection. But these pieces are really built. They unfortunately don't come across that well in photographs, but when you see them in person, you're invited to engage in a way where the volumes that might be surrounded, like on the top of that back one, are move into the space that's defined by the lower one, and so you have the opportunity to do as you like in that configuration, or for this moment you might prefer the horizontal shape over the vertical, and then you can have that, or you can walk 2 steps that way, and then it might seem to you to be nicer to look at the vertical space underneath. And they're very much. We was talking to Anne Goodyear a bit ago about how the floor, the meaning of the floor, has changed during these years, and what this exhibition, which dreadful word, the experimental side of this exhibition, I think is suggesting a new place of the floor. And of course, that's directly related to our recent history of medical issues and social changes and everything that's been going on. But you basically in this form, you're not seeing the roots as in a tree, where the tree wouldn't be there without the roots. And so in a way, maybe I could make that analogy, that these wouldn't be there without the roots either, as you don't see them. However, I'm very excited at the moment about the possibility of taking one of the bronze pieces and putting it outdoors, in which case the large piece will go back to the small models, some of which you can see on the table on the left, that are sitting on a very, very specific base, for lack of a better word. But I actually would rather use the word roots than base. And so, I've, of course, a lot of the wooden ones were made in our place up in Mount Desert. And there we have wonderful landscaping there, and I got to see the one that's in the back out in nature, and it fulfilled a requirement of mine, where a sculpture outside is supposed to interrelate to its natural setting and itself, so that it enhances your experience of sculpture and nature all at the same time. And it worked magnificently, because you just be out and walking around, and your eye would just go to that like it was food, just to have a hit of what that gave. So I'm looking forward to, we can't put those out of doors. I did try to put one out of doors. It lasted about 1.5 ice storms and was gone. But the bronze should stand up like that. And I think that is probably the time. Thank you.
It's so nice to be with you all digitally, although I wish it could be in person. I can't see your faces, but I imagine they're wonderful faces. So I'm going to start by presenting my work in general, and then I'll talk specifically about some prints I've been working on. As Anne mentioned, I work in a space between textile, sculpture, and painting. This was a show installed in 2018 in Chicago. So my general work, the surfaces are created by spinning and weaving wool that you can see in the more opaque squares, and then painting fabric with paints made from stone pigments that I grind and make myself. The works are then sewn into compositions and stretched around custom stretchers. In this case, the stretcher bars have been blackened by fire. Often I also place small objects between the stretcher bars, such as crystals or other pieces that I fabricate out of steel or glass. To me, this brings the work farther out of the image-based language of painting and more into the touched and physical plane. Here is a more recent work, Convergence Memory, and another, Quartz Valley. And as you can see, the surfaces of these, I build up topographies that the pigment is able to pool in, which becomes like a kind of monoprint without a press. Turning more explicitly towards printmaking, I'd like to focus on some of the work I've been doing with Farrington Press, which is an observatory and a print shop outside of Joshua Tree, California. So my friend Kyle Simon, who was a master printer at Pace for many years, moved out to the desert maybe a decade ago and bought some land, and that land had an observatory, which he has restored. So part of making prints here is that the celestial is always clear sky. And then the print shop itself, this is a photo of the print shop, is off grid. So all the power is solar. You have to bring in all the water yourself. And one is very aware of the physicality of the surroundings and how much labor actually takes to make a print. And so all of these qualities of touch and of physicality, as well as ethereality and thinking about the cosmos, all of these come together in the physical location of the shop. And I just wanted to tell you about a single edition that we've been working on. This is called The Colors of a Cholla Cactus After Rain in Late Summer or Early Fall. It's hard to see here, but these aren't collages. They're all about 6 or 7 passes through the etching press. And and here you can see a little bit closer. So to make these prints, we started with making an angular stretcher out of wood, similar to my paintings. And then we forged some sheet metal from the dump. And that has been, as you can kind of see to the left and the right, pockmarked by wind and weather. And we cut that into geometric shapes. And then I wove this very fine silk in the middle and upper part of it. And it looks a little like cheesecloth, but the hand weaving actually allows inconsistency in the seams to come through. And so it makes a difference. That's us inside the print shop. These are the wood frames. And the metal, here's the metal printed. And here's a larger view of everything going on. And so, as I mentioned, working in this particular setting, the surrounding landscape is really impossible to get away from, which is what makes the experience so significant. As Anne mentioned in my bio, I've been thinking a lot about how faith and landscape intersect, both historically and spiritually. So being in a space that has both a history and just a general feeling really starts to enter into these prints. So the colors all come from looking at the cholla cactuses and then the mountains and the night sky. And thinking about printmaking in place, I think all work is affected by place, but I think printmaking especially, because it's so durational and absorptive, is something that really seems to share the mark of where it's made. It feels like if you hear print being made in Cameron and Albuquerque or Wisconsin, it's maybe you wouldn't guess it right away, but after you know, it's so clear that it has that place and that mark. So maybe that's the printers, but I would argue it's the place itself. And just even if that isn't true for my own prints and my own work, I'd like to create a kinship between the surfaces and the landscape in which they're made. And is that in color, or is it in material? I think all of that adds to it, and especially in making prints in these contexts where every material is coming from so far and has to be intentionally chosen, that comes through. But more than anything, it's an essence that I'm interested in. And so I'm going out there again, and we're working on these mono prints with stone surfaces that were collected from the Ohio's, which is actually seems so simple, but has been quite a difficult physical feat, just because we're printing them in a hydraulic press, which is a press that comes down vertically and applies pressure equally. And the rocks have to stay perfectly flat. So we have to make these plates with a very large contraption for a very simple print. And I've been thinking about reading the catalog essays for the Frankenthaler, and that in every print, maybe even more than paintings, there's problems to solve. And those are visual, spiritual problems like any other artwork, but they're also very physical and tangible. And I think how that brings these larger questions back to the physical world is very interesting to me. And I think it also requires collaboration and really going back and forth with people who know a lot. And and I love that part of printmaking. So that's what I've been working on printmaking wise, and what I will be working on. And just finish up, here's some photos of print shop dogs, which are always the best part of printmaking, in my opinion. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Last week I had the privilege and the pleasure of talking with Martha and Richard a little bit about this afternoon's program, and I was treated to a really exquisite conversation between these two remarkable artists who know one another so well. And so I think I'm going to turn the microphone over to Richard Tuttle, and Martha, maybe I'll invite you, if you would be willing, perhaps to begin our conversation. I know that you had some questions that you had in mind with respect to today's conversation that you thought might be interesting to pose to Richard.
Yeah, I would love to ask those questions. I think going off of Richard's response, in which he said that he's actually moving away from print, maybe that's actually a good start, and why that doesn't feel such a generative part of your practice at the moment.
I could say my daughter's doing a much better job than I could ever do in that direction.
That's nice, but it feels a bit of a cop-out.
I think in printmaking occupies a special place that cannot be occupied by anything else, and it should be used by an artist very, very respectfully when they need it. And I always say that the print is the one part of the way art can develop, whether you're talking about painting or sculpture, that where the didactic side of the pursuit is expected, invited, and available to be exercised in absolute totality. And when you get out of that, then that didactic should never be part of your work. And before you get to that point, the didactic should never be part of that work. And that's because I find, printmaking is extremely seductive in terms of the sensuality of it, the materials, the smells, but there's a lot of artists who are seduced by all of that, and then their work, the work that is not supposed to be didactic, starts having didactic qualities in it. I don't think that's fair to the way I see art as I mean, I think, I believe that society has invented art. It just happens that these people, like who now we call artists, came to do the job because even though the society invented it, they didn't know how to do the job. So these people who were floating around got that chance to do it. And it's a great privilege, but it all should be respected on all sides. And it shouldn't be, so like Martha, I remember I said to you and Anne that I made my contribution. And if that contribution was not enough, I'm sorry, it's my fault. But I'm not going to hang around
What exactly do you mean by didactic? Why is printmaking a didactic art?
One of the things I've known with good printmakers is they tend to be people who have something to say. So, if you met them shopping for carrots in the food market, they would have something to say. And not every artist has something to say like that, or there's not a didactic part. But actually, in this afternoon, my contribution was my little text. And I think that's clear to everybody that, well, Richard is somebody who really needs to say something, and needs to, and so, and I have my print catalog on my knee. Every single print is, full of stuff. Like, what's the, okay, is that okay? Because we could go.
Yeah, no, that
Maybe Richard, we should turn to you and ask if you have a question for Martha.
Okay. Here's one, Martha. This is I hope this is not this is oof. But we looked at this at the Frankenthaler Sandman show, and the last print. Frankenthaler's print was made by Pace Prints. And I said to Anne that I would never make a print with Pace, because somehow they got it mixed up from the earliest moments, where they thought that the print was about abstract, should be abstract, because that was a time when abstraction was dominant or something. But I deeply, deeply feel that the print, what's great about the print is it's concrete. It is something that you can put on a table. You can take a chunk out of it, and that's why I think it has this foundational aspect, because I think the didactic is a great tool to get us to concrete things, especially if we're going to take a trip out to the end of the universe and try really abstract ideas, or that we need to come off of something that's as concrete. And there you go, man. That's a good question for. Okay. Let me phrase the question this way: do you ever think to put a stone in a print?
I think it's not within the realm, outside of the realm of possibility, but I am interested in single sheet prints at the moment, and translating that physicality into an image. I think that's something I can't do with my other studio work, so I'm more interested in it happening in prints. Yeah, that's probably the answer to your question. I am curious though if the opposite of abstract is actually concrete. It seems not like a definition that I would necessarily choose for prints, although I understand where you're coming from.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you if in the pressure that it looks like you're getting set up to use the stones, those flat stones and with pressure. Mm-hmm. Is there a relationship to what happens with your work when you weave? Do you feel any inner connection?
Yeah, I mean, what's always been interesting to me about weaving, and just specifically about spinning and weaving, is it's a kind of line drawing or surface drawing that incorporates touch throughout the surface. And I think the pressure of the press actually creates something very similar. So I don't have a standard relation, because of course anybody who weaves knows that there's a lot of pressure with the beater in the making of fabric. I don't have a strong relationship with that, but in terms of how you translate the physicality of a surface into a flat plane, I think the two have a lot together. That's a lot to say to each other. That's a really good question.
That's why your prints are so beautiful, I think, because of that relation, you're having. And don't you all agree?
Absolutely.
Everybody agrees with that. Yeah.
I wonder if I could jump in. Oh, sorry, Martha.
Sorry. Yeah, you just he's mic'd up, but it's better.
Martha and Richard, I wondered if I could jump in with one question, and then I'd like to open it up to the audience. Martha and Richard, when we were speaking last week, Martha, I think you made an observation about printmaking as an art form that creates generations, that one perhaps generates an image from a plate, for example. And that was a word that I think may have come up in part because we were talking about families. And one of the things that intrigues me about At First Light, our current exhibition, is how many creative families happen to be represented in that. So with this idea of generations in mind and the many things it could mean, I am curious, Martha, whether you feel there are printmaking problems or topics or issues that you, or perhaps this generation of artists, may be grappling with that perhaps are distinct from questions that may have been explored by previous generations of printmakers. And then, Richard, by the same token, I loved your remarks and this idea of what it means to age or to grow old or to think about perhaps what it means for something to pass on. And if that's the case, what lessons you think perhaps as an experienced printmaker ought to be delivered to future generations. So a question for each of you, but flip sides of the same coin.
Yeah, like at first thought, it would seem that there must be 1,000 new conversations in the way that we're all exposed to the internet, and that's constantly recreating images of the same material. And I think if you're thinking about imprinting and generational information and generational images, would be impossible to be making even the most abstract prints and not be aware of that and make within that context. So I think that that's worth saying. At the same time, at least among my peers and my experiences, I'm not sure, even if one is working with a digital medium or a new media, the question of how you make an image, like what's a new way to tell a story, what's a new way to generate a surface, seem to be actually repeating questions. And maybe that's more interesting to me, that I'm not sure if we as a species ever really generate new questions. It's just like new ways of answering them from generation to generation, and with the influx of new global information.
Thank you so much, Martha. Those are beautiful reflections. Richard?
I'm wired.
Oh, I forgot you were wired.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Anyway, I thought we were going to talk about pressure, so I brought this book, but I looked through it and I realized that, if the question is, what do you think a print is? Way back from the beginning, my answer would be, like, if you saw a Native American take, pigment in their hand and put their hand on the haunch of the horse. And so you would see this hand, that was fixed to the fur and the musculature of the horse. That is my idea of the most beautiful print that's ever happened, And I realized in this whole book, that's what I've been trying to do with print. But at the same time, I've collected European prints. I can tell you about Mantua in the Middle Ages and armor, and I can tell you hundreds of stories about that. But so my advice to future generations is think about the haunch of the horse, not about the tradition of printmaking, because that is, I think, as Martha says, each generation can, put their hand on the side of the horse in a fresh and new and exciting, because it's the print itself is exciting. And people who, in print shops, every time someone pulls a print off the press, everybody collects around there. Thousands of prints come up because it's just an exciting thing. When I say I'm taking a sabbatical, it's a sacrifice to do it, but I'm doing it for higher reasons. Higher purposes.
Well, we're glad that you're here to talk with us about your practices. And on that note, I would love to open the floor to our audience, because I know there are many makers and scholars in this space, appreciators of the fine arts who may have questions for each of you. Anybody want to raise a question?
Everyone's had a lot already.
I had a moment when you were talking about prints and shadows, and I wanted to ask a question about, I just flashed on the possibility and just curious if there could be a connection between printmaking and shadows. And I mean that sort of spatially and temporally.
Is that to Martha? Could you hear that question?
Oh, I think that's to you.
Well, an answer that comes to mind. I'm doing this Calder show in LA, and we're doing a publication for that. And I had this idea to make the end papers here, these fold-out sheets, of a mobile, like called a mobile. And when I went to the one I thought I could just take shots of, I wasn't interested in the physical forms, but the shadows that they were cast on the floor it interested me a lot, and was what I was looking for. And I felt that there's striking. There's in those shadows catch a kind of sculptural truth that then goes all the way up into the physicality of the piece. And I think to answer your question, if you turn that in reverse, there you would find a relation between the print and the shadow, because there are there's a kind of thumbnail definition of the shadow that it's soul, but that's I think it's too simple, too materialistic or something. I don't know. Yeah.
I think we have another question.
I have a question that's for both of you, really. It's how you see your relationship to the printers you work with. A lot of the printmakers I know are on their own. They're in the studio working with the press and doing all the processes. And both of you work with people who facilitate your final product, and I'm curious how that generates excitement, how that brings new ideas, how you perceive that.
I can jump in. Yeah, for me, printmaking is truly a collaboration with the printer. And these recent prints that I've been working on with Kyle Simon, they wouldn't have been made without him. And I think it's always like, if I have an idea, bringing an idea, then figuring it out physically generates so much more creativity and so much more interest than just the idea itself or the physical processes. So I think my dad mentioned printmaking can be so fun, and for me that's really like the root of the fun, is just working with somebody and really kind of having a generative conversation. But I think, yeah, it's always feels a little bit tricky, because if the print gets shown, it has like the artist name and maybe the shop, but the printers, in my opinion, are just as much responsible for generating those works. And then also, like, then the artist goes home and the printers are the people who are doing the work and making it happen. And so, yeah, I feel like there's not always enough of a conversation around that. How important that collaborative and how significant it aspect is.
Mm-hmm. Are you a printer?
Yes.
We love you. One of my lines is, finding your printer is a bigger deal than finding your spouse. Because it's there's something just the way a line talks, and it's I was at somebody mentioned the Getty, and I think you mentioned the Getty. I would go there. They have collection of thousands, and because I heard somebody said that the only way you can learn about prints is just to see them hundreds and hundreds, and just spend. And then you'll absorb that special thing. There's this, I don't know. I just wrote a text about watercolor, and I made this distinction: the difference between a line and an edge. And I personally, I find there's so much more available if you're drawing an edge than you're drawing a line. And the printmaking, I think, what's the difference between drawing and printmaking? Well, like in a way, in drawing, you are always drawing a mere line. It's so reducible to a mere line. But in printmaking, you can aspire to do the drawn edge. And I think that's what Martha is saying, that somehow, in the best sense, that edge will include the printer, and its richnesses are immeasurable, I think.
I mean, in a kind of admittedly idealistic way that these relationships don't always function this way in the real world. But I also like to think of printmaking as a medium that has like a radical potential for breaking down some of the individuality focus of the art world, which I think is long overdue. And I think because most work doesn't come out of a vacuum, probably none of it does, but because it has more of that explicit use of many people's skills and many people's intelligences and visions, I think that there's like a lot of cool possibility in printmaking for collective practice and collaborative ideas.
Mike, and then Mark. We'll start with Mike. He's up front. Then we'll go to Mark.
Quick question, maybe. Richard, I think you said in your talk that we can control nature, but we can't control art. And I think I might agree with you mostly. And I think most people would not agree with you.
Okay.
And I'm wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about why that particular distinction is important.
Okay. I think we're. I just had my cataracts done, and I've been thinking. I think my whole life about these. I call them theological issues. And suddenly, with this new interocular eye, I felt I could see things very clearly. That there is a difference between, the deity and the nature. In fact, the deity is what made the nature, and the control is there. And so, thank you for picking it. It's a little bit of a joke in there because I find between that we ourselves have a part of us that is unknowable, immeasurable, but it's the boss, it's what controls everything. And then you have nature, which is what you, in fact, should learn everything about that's possible, because that's the only way you'll know what can't be known. And control is one of the ways you can know. You can try to control nature all you like, but you wind up. Okay, so where I'm really trying to go with this is that art is somehow sits in this in between place where it's not the deity, it's not nature, and yet in the fact that I guess what I'm actually trying to say is there that the deity itself cannot control art. That's because it's only okay. Martha, he's asking for your opinion.
That feels like your conversation.
Although one thing that sort of struck me in Mike's comments that was resonant to me in both of your talks is the role of nature itself. That nature seems to be an element or an ingredient in your thinking, whether it's the solar power of the press, or whether it's Richard putting a piece outdoors. I don't know, that's one of the things that at least came to my mind, Mike, when you raised this question of the relationship between nature and art.
Yeah, I guess for me, I have a feeling that the nature that I'm referring to is not the same one that you are saying when you say we can control nature, but we can't control art. So yeah, just to throw that in as a caveat. I think I am interested in the way that nature can enter printing or just making in general in an uncontrolled way. Something that I noticed visiting Lancaster, Pennsylvania recently was that the Amish communities have made a lot of use of solar panels. So I did a lot of research into that. And Lancaster, for those of you, different Amish communities have different rules. Lancaster tends to be a relatively liberal one. But that the bishop has decided that because solar power is God-given, the sun is God-given, that becomes a okay use of energy for things like agriculture and farm work. So that really stuck with me thinking in solar power, because it is a human invention and it's a way of working with nature, but it's still ultimately up to the sun, up to the weather. It's a collaboration. And I think, in my work, that's what was so interesting about working with solar power electricity, that the hydraulic press takes a lot of energy. And so we really only have one shot before we use up all the energy. And it just creates a different way of working that makes a less controlled nature. But I'm not sure that's the same nature that you were referring to.
Why don't we take one final question from Mark Wesley.
This goes to Richard. I loved your remarks about growing older, being older, and likewise, I loved the images we were seeing at the same time. And I was reflecting on artists who get to later life, Matisse, Picasso, de Kooning. And in those end periods, Beethoven, in those end periods, there's kind of a euphoric, transcendent release, I would describe it, many of their work. I, for one, also see a difference in this work. Do you reflect on that? Do you feel yourself moving into a space of more liberty or something different?
I do, and I'm a little bit nervous about committing to a lifelong creative work because you get engaged with will, and what will is it? I mean, some of us can claim we can perform the will of something else, or we can feel guided to have a life long relationship with creativity. But I find, and so I've thought among other contributions, I may be able to contribute to what we know about creativity in our senior periods, because it's one thing to be creative when you're 20, it's another thing to be creative when you're 80, 85, and what is making you creative, or what is, and that I find, because our creativity is one of the joys of our lives, if we have that, or if we can respond to that. And so how can we have better lives, and except through collecting data, as it were, and sharing it. So, and I do particularly. There's there's this wonderful moment where certain issues just drop, and then something still goes on, and I find that alone is exciting to me, and I can see it in Beethoven, I can see it in Goya, and I can see it in Titian, and so on. So, and it is that distinction between getting old but not growing old, and that I think is, because if life has meaning, in a spiritual way, it grows because everything else our brains collapse, our bodies collapse, but our spirits can keep growing and growing and growing, and art and creativity and are certainly, because each of us, we're together, but we're also alone. And this is a funny part of the traditional printmaking, where, this is why I base my idea that printmaking is concrete, because there's a origin of it where metal workers who were decorating metal had to use oil, and that oil became blacker and blacker, and they couldn't see where they were in the design, so they were going to draw a figure or something. And so somebody had this idea just to wipe off that oil and take a piece of paper and put the paper on there, and then you see exactly where you are in the design. And that, so that's a kind of engraving, you know, or intaglio printing. And but that's like life too, that the more you ask of life and the engagement increases, then you're in a position where you need something out there to tell you where you are, you know. And I will say that and what Martha is doing is amazing to me, because it's you know, she can think she's doing whatever she wants to think, but I can see that this is a person who's you know, beloved to me, and she's very deeply concerned in trying to figure out where she is, and that's the hand on the haunch of the horse, if there ever was. You know? Yeah.
Martha, do you have any comments in response?
No, I think that's a good final word.
I couldn't agree more. This has been such a beautiful conversation. I'm so happy that it was recorded, because you each have shared observations that are deeply engaging. I think you've both given us so much food for thought. This is a program that I think is going to nourish us for a long time to come. We are extremely grateful, Richard, to you for your participation in the program, in this conversation. Martha, we are so grateful to you for being part of this program virtually. It's wonderful to hear your reflections. It's exciting to think about how the print fits into a larger universe of art making. And above all, it's exciting to think about how creative practice fits more broadly within each of our human lives. Thank you both, and we will look forward to continuing the conversation in weeks, months, years to come. Thanks to each of you for being here with us for this discussion.
Thank you, and